The fourth year my own children forgot me, I didn't shed a single tear. My eyes stayed dry, my heart stayed steady, and something inside me finally settled into place. Not anger. Not shock. Just a quiet decision I should have made long ago. I stopped waiting for them to remember me, and I started preparing for the day they would finally realize what they had thrown away. You're probably wondering how a mother reaches that point. How a woman who once rearranged her holidays for every scraped knee and every forgotten school project could reach a moment where she no longer flinched when she received nothing but silence. I'll tell you how. It happens slowly. A missed call here. An excuse there. A holiday mix-up followed by another, and another, until neglect becomes tradition. But stay with me, because the moment they came back to my door wasn't filled with warmth, hugs, or overdue apologies. No. They arrived with a kind of forced confidence, expecting the same woman who always gave in. The same woman who opened her arms even when she was treated like an old coat left in a basement. They had no clue the ground had shifted. When they reached my front porch, they didn't just find me. The officers were already standing by the steps. A news camera was pointed straight at the doorway. Bright, unfiltered light filled the hall, and for the first time in years, they were the ones standing frozen. Their mouths hung open, faces drained, unable to understand how everything had turned back toward them so sharply. I had spent years swallowing their excuses, bending myself smaller, telling myself they'd eventually remember I existed. But that day, when they stepped into my hallway with the cameras rolling, it was my turn to watch. My turn to see them speechless. My turn to witness the moment they finally realized I was done being an afterthought. You want to know how we reached this exact moment? The officers, the cameras, their stunned silence, and the quiet strength in my voice? Sit with me. I'll guide you through every moment that led them to this doorstep. Nothing is exaggerated. Nothing is softened. Only the truth, spoken by a woman who finally stopped asking for a seat at her own family table. Before I continue, if you're the kind of person who would never abandon an elder in your family, prove it. Hit subscribe. If not, you can join the others in the comments explaining why kindness is too much to ask. People assume a mother stops being needed once her children grow up, but that isn't true. Not for me. For most of my life, I was the first call the moment anything went wrong. When my oldest had his first apartment and couldn't pay the light bill, I helped him. When my daughter had her second child and felt overwhelmed, I took the night shifts. Birthdays, graduations, job losses, heartbreaks. I was the steady hand that never pulled away. That was my place in their world, and I carried it with pride. My home used to be the center of every holiday. I baked enough food to feed our whole street. My grandchildren would run through the hallway, laughing so loudly the windows shook. Those moments weren't fancy, but they were full. I held on to them tightly, because I believed love, once given wholeheartedly, always finds its way back. I didn't expect to become someone they waved off when it suited them. Over the years, I began noticing a subtle shift. It wasn't loud or obvious. Just small signs that my presence no longer mattered the way it used to. One Christmas was accidentally double booked. Another was cancelled because they weren't organizing anything big that year. Only to later find out they celebrated without me. I would see their smiling photos online, every adult child standing shoulder to shoulder, while I sat at home wondering what I had done wrong. Still, I tried to understand. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they assumed I preferred peace and quiet. Maybe they thought I was tougher than I am. I've lived long enough to know that hope can blind you to the truth. You tell yourself you're imagining things, because the alternative hurts too much to acknowledge. The turning point came during Thanksgiving, long before the incident at my door. They placed me at a small table off to the side, away from the main group. No one said anything cruel. No one raised their voice. But their actions said enough. I watched my family laugh and enjoy each other while I felt like an outsider in a space I helped build. I didn't complain. Mothers are expected to swallow the hurt and keep smiling. So I did. I kept offering help. I kept showing up. I kept pretending everything was fine because I didn't want tension. Yet with every holiday ignored, every forgotten birthday call, every message left unanswered. Something inside me slowly wore down. You can give unconditional love, but once you're treated like a burden, you begin to question whether your loyalty is being used against you. By the third Christmas mix-up, my heart felt heavier than I could admit out loud. Not because they forgot me, but because they didn't seem bothered by it. No apology. No attempt to correct it the next year. Just silence wrapped in excuses. When I confronted them gently, they brushed it off as me being too emotional. That was the moment I realized they no longer saw me as a person with feelings, just a background figure they could acknowledge when convenient. Still, I held on to hope a little longer. That's the thing about parents. We don't give up easily. We cling to the belief that our children will come back to their senses, that one day they'll remember everything we did for them. But hope without action can turn into self-neglect, and that was the path I had unknowingly walked for years. The fourth year arrived quietly, without warning, without a phone call, without even a polite check-in. Just like that, the holiday was happening without me again. They posted photos with captions about family traditions, while I stared at my empty living room. The same room that once held all their childhood memories now felt like a museum of things they no longer cared about. I sat in that silence for hours. I replayed every moment from their childhood, every sacrifice, every late-night worry, every celebration I planned, every lesson I taught. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of pretending their neglect was an oversight. Tired of making excuses for behavior they didn't bother to fix. Tired of waiting for a phone call that never came. The part that cut the deepest wasn't being forgotten. It was realizing they didn't see the harm in forgetting me. People like to say that family is forever. But the truth is, family is only real when everyone participates. When only one person is holding the threads, it becomes something else entirely, something one-sided and draining. So, I made a choice. A quiet, steady choice. I stopped hoping they would change, and I redefined where I placed my heart. I told myself, if they can live without me so easily, then they can handle the consequences of losing access to me. That decision didn't come from rage. It came from clarity. Years of memories, both joyful and painful, settled into a simple understanding. Love doesn't mean tolerance without limits. Even a mother reaches a point where she must protect her dignity. I didn't know what the future would bring. I didn't know they would show up unannounced. I didn't know the day would come when I'd stand in my own hallway watching them freeze under bright lights, finally confronted with the truth they ignored. But in that quiet season, in that shift of perspective, I reclaimed something they had taken for granted, my worth. That year, Christmas arrived like any other winter day, cold and quiet. But for me, it carried a weight unlike before, a sense of being erased, replaced, ignored. I scrolled through social media one evening, expecting the usual parade of festive posts. I expected smiles, snow, and the warmth of shared memories. What I did not expect was to see myself absent in the images, absent in the captions, absent in the conversation entirely. My name was missing from every list, my presence assumed irrelevant. The post came from Brielle, Wesley's wife, finalizing our huge family Christmas celebration. Can't wait to see everyone in 2 weeks. There it was, a curated list of attendees, my children, my grandchildren, all included. All except me. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling the familiar tug of loneliness, but this time it wasn't accompanied by tears. Instead, a clear, cold determination settled in. My children, the people I had spent decades guiding and supporting, had crossed a line. This was no accident, no miscommunication. They had deliberately chosen to leave me out for the fourth time. It was a pattern. And patterns speak louder than apologies ever could. The previous years had left me small, apologizing for being forgotten, bending toward explanations, trying to rationalize their disregard. But 4 times. 4 holidays. 4 chances they chose self-interest over family loyalty. That day, I realized they weren't going to suddenly see the truth on their own. They needed a lesson in consequence. I thought of every small humiliation I had endured. Being seated at the side table, excluded from conversations, ignored during planning, brushed off with casual explanations. I recalled every painstaking effort to keep the family connected, from handmade ornaments to long drives to visit distant relatives. Every moment had been a thread in the fabric of our family, yet they treated me as though I were invisible. In that instant, grief transformed into clarity. I would not let this pass. I would not quietly accept their absence, not anymore. They had turned my presence into a convenience, my support into a given, and my love into a backdrop for their own celebrations. They would see what happens when the matriarch steps out of reach, not permanently, but just enough to force recognition. I began envisioning the steps I would take. It was not impulsive, nor was it rooted in vindictiveness. It was strategy. It was justice measured in patience and precision. I would remove myself from their orbit for a time, allow the silence to grow heavy, and let the absence speak more powerfully than any confrontation ever could. 2 weeks of uncertainty. 2 weeks of reflection. 2 weeks for them to finally understand what my quiet presence had meant to their lives. And so, I started planning. Not wildly, not recklessly. I wrote lists, prepared contingencies, and thought through every possibility. I imagined their frantic calls and unanswered texts. I imagined their confusion as the usual routines failed to reach me. I imagined them realizing, bit by bit, that the woman they counted on, the woman they assumed would always be there, had intentionally removed herself from the equation. For the first time in decades, I placed myself at the center of my own narrative. I was not a supporting character in their story anymore. I was the author, the architect, the one who controlled the flow of events. And control, when wielded with purpose and patience, is a form of power they had never respected. That evening, I closed my laptop, feeling the resolve strengthen with every heartbeat. Christmas would arrive without me, but it would not pass unnoticed. When the day came for them to attempt entry, they would find more than an empty home. They would find a mother fully aware of her worth, a woman prepared to assert her dignity, and a family confronted with the consequences of their repeated disregard. I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, not cruel, but just enough to know that justice, measured in absence and anticipation, can have a voice louder than confrontation. That year, I would not be overlooked. That year, I would be remembered, not for being present, but for being seen when they finally realized they could no longer ignore me. It was the calm before the storm. But the storm, when it came, would carry a quiet ferocity, a force made not of anger but of clarity, foresight, and unshakable resolve. And in that clarity, I knew they would feel, for the first time, the weight of their choices. After the fourth holiday left me invisible, I knew that waiting quietly was no longer enough. My children had repeatedly demonstrated that their attention, care, and acknowledgement were optional in my life. This wasn't simply hurt feelings, it was a pattern of neglect, an ongoing refusal to honor the woman who had raised them, who had sacrificed for them, who had held the family together for decades. I realized that if they wanted my presence to mean anything, they had to earn it. And earning it, in this case, required a plan more deliberate than any holiday gathering I had ever orchestrated. I began with the basics, distance and silence. I chose my mountain cabin, deep in the Allegheny National Forest, far removed from their social radar, the only place they could never casually drop by. 4 hours from home, rustic, secluded, and off-grid. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a fortress of calm, a place where I could operate without interference, and more importantly, a place where I could control every detail of my visibility. I packed carefully, bringing only what was necessary, including enough supplies to remain entirely self-sufficient for weeks. Communication was the next step. I changed my home voicemail to a neutral, impersonal message. I am currently handling matters that require my full attention. Please do not leave a message. I sent a matching, vague text to Wesley and Danica, unexpected travel. Out of range for the next few days. Don't worry, I'm fine. Each word was chosen to instill certainty without alarm, creating a foundation of plausible absence while maintaining absolute control. I scheduled a social media post showing a bird at my feeder, timestamped for Christmas Eve, to reinforce the illusion that I was home but slightly occupied. Even these small details were crucial. They created the narrative my family would assume was true. Next, I prepared for the legal and strategic side. I contacted my longtime friend, Elias Thorne, a respected corporate litigation attorney with a keen understanding of both law and leverage. I walked him through the repeated neglect, each forgotten holiday, each missed call, each slight brushed off with an excuse. Elias understood immediately. He drafted a temporary restraining order and prepared the legal groundwork, not as a weapon for me to wield blindly, but as a shield to assert my boundaries and protect my autonomy. I didn't stop there. The plan required a public dimension. Years of quiet charitable work in my community became a tool. I reached out to the directors of the local senior center and a children's charity I had supported for decades. I explained the situation, repeated emotional neglect, deliberate exclusion, and the need for broader awareness to prevent similar situations for others. Both directors were eager to assist. They connected me to a reporter named Sierra Ruiz, who specialized in human interest stories. Her involvement would ensure that, should my family attempt to enter my home, the truth would not remain private. It would be witnessed, documented, and undeniable. Every detail of my life during those 2 weeks was orchestrated to maintain the tension. I knew they would expect a call, a message, or some signal that I was alive and well. I didn't provide one. Their frustration would mount, their worry would grow, and eventually, their panic would take hold. I could almost see it forming, a spiral of concern that shifted from irritation to dread. Their repeated negligence had created the perfect conditions for accountability. Supplies, communications, legal documents, media coordination, every piece was in place, but the most critical element was my own presence and posture. I would not be the frail, apologetic mother they expected. I would be steady, confident, prepared, and fully aware of the power they had forfeited. When they arrived, the confrontation would not be about anger or retribution alone. It would be a lesson in presence, consequence, and personal authority. The cabin became my anchor. There, I visualized the sequence of events, imagining the growing anxiety on their faces as calls went unanswered, as messages were ignored, as days passed. I imagined Wesley pacing, Brielle frantically texting, Danica leaving tearful voicemails, and Dominique trying desperately to maintain composure. Every reaction was anticipated, every outcome considered, every contingency addressed. I also considered the broader impact. Their embarrassment, once exposed to media attention, would carry weight beyond our household. It wasn't about public shaming for the sake of cruelty. It was about demonstrating that repeated neglect has consequences and that adult children cannot treat their elders as invisible without accountability. In those quiet days, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Clarity. I wasn't simply reacting to hurt feelings. I was asserting the dignity that had been dismissed. I was reclaiming the respect I had earned through years of sacrifice. I was converting absence into authority, silence into leverage, and all of it relied on patience. The days I remained unseen, untouched by their frantic search, were as important as the moment of confrontation itself. Because power is not only an action, it is in timing. Their realization, after 2 weeks of growing uncertainty, would hit them harder than any argument or plea. It would be immediate, undeniable, and irreversible. This was no ordinary plan. It was a demonstration of autonomy, foresight, and the consequences of repeated indifference. And at the center of it, waiting patiently, was me, Beatrice Albright. Calm, prepared, and finally in control of the narrative I had once allowed others to write for me. The morning of January 9th arrived crisp and silent. The air in my New England home was cold, but inside me, a different kind of warmth had taken root. The satisfaction of preparation, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing every piece is in place. I dressed carefully, not in pajamas or a robe, but in a tailored winter suit. My hair was pinned neatly, my posture straight. I would not appear as the frail mother they assumed I had become. No, today I would be the one who set the terms of engagement. By mid-morning, I heard the first sounds of the day I had anticipated for weeks. The crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of car doors, the hurried shuffle of feet across the porch. I moved silently toward the window and peered through the sheer curtains. There they were, Wesley and Brielle, haggard and tense, their faces etched with the anxiety that 2 weeks of uncertainty had finally produced. Behind them, Danica and Dominique followed, trying to project concern, but their eyes betrayed it. The patrol car pulled up behind them, a reminder that this was no ordinary family visit. They had enlisted law enforcement to force their way, assuming my absence had been unintentional, unaware that every element of this morning had been orchestrated to ensure they felt the weight of their actions. Their attempts to use the spare key under the ceramic frog statue were clumsy, nervous. I watched as Danica fumbled, muttering under her breath. When the lock finally clicked, the front door creaked open, and I allowed the scene to unfold exactly as I had envisioned. My children stepped inside, eyes wide, mouths opening and closing as they processed the reality of my composed presence. "Mom! Beatrice! What on earth?" Wesley's voice trembled, a mixture of relief and frustration. "You're fine? We've been terrified," Brielle exclaimed, already reaching toward me, probably hoping a hug would erase 2 weeks of neglect. I raised a hand, cutting her off instantly. Silence fell. My voice was steady, low, and measured. "Don't take another step." Every word carried the weight of the years they had ignored, every holiday they had excluded me, every moment of being treated as optional. Before they could recover, the door swung open further. My attorney, Elias Thorne, entered, papers in hand, followed by Sierra Ruiz and a cameraman whose lights illuminated the hallway, stark and unrelenting. My family froze, caught between shock and recognition. The police officer behind them looked uncertain, witnessing an unexpected layer of legal authority entering the room. Elias spoke with authority. "As your legal counsel, I must advise you that you are trespassing. You are also being served with a temporary restraining order." Thick folders were handed to Wesley, Danica, Brielle, and Dominique. Their hands trembled as they processed the formal documentation. The realization struck immediately. They were not in control. The matriarch they assumed they could ignore had returned on her terms. Sierra stepped forward, microphone poised. "Mr. Albright, can you comment on the repeated exclusion of your mother from family celebrations, leading to this legal action?" The camera rolled, capturing their expressions in raw, unfiltered honesty. Relief, confusion, shame, and fear all mingled on their faces. I stood slowly, addressing them and the camera alike. I did not disappear because of illness, or because I sought isolation. I disappeared because I was deliberately forgotten by the people who claimed to love me. I was ignored, brushed aside, and treated as a convenience. This is not about a holiday. This is about respect, and the absence of it, for too long. The police officer gently guided them onto the porch, and Elias ensured the legal process was enforced without obstruction. My children were left to confront their own choices in front of an audience larger than they had anticipated. The humiliation was real, immediate, and unavoidable. I closed the door and stood in my hallway, breathing in the quiet, feeling the weight of victory that had nothing to do with anger or confrontation, and everything to do with self-respect and foresight. The news cameras documented the moment, ensuring that the world could witness that repeated neglect carries consequences. And here, I pause to remind you, dear viewer, some people never understand the value of presence until it's gone. If you would never allow an elder in your life to be treated as optional, subscribe now and be the kind of person who acts before it's too late. If you choose not to subscribe, leave a comment explaining why you think loyalty, respect, and care can be ignored. The conversation matters. That day, my revenge was not in shouting or rage. It was in patience, strategy, and timing. It was in allowing my absence to speak louder than any argument ever could. Their frantic calls, their escalating panic, the legal papers in their hands, the live camera capturing every second. It all converged to teach them a lesson they would never forget. In those moments, I understood something vital. Power is not always demonstrated through force. Sometimes, it is measured in clarity, in planning, in the courage to step back and let the truth reveal itself. For decades, I had been a quiet force in their lives. Today, that force became undeniable, visible, and unforgettable. And as I watched my family retreat, their pride shattered, their assumptions exposed, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. Not the gloating of victory, but the quiet fulfillment of someone finally reclaiming what had been dismissed. A mother, once ignored, now recognized not by pleading, but by ensuring her presence and absence carried weight. After the confrontation, the house settled into an unusual calm. The sound of distant traffic, the faint hum of heaters, and the quiet tick of clocks were all that broke the stillness. My family had retreated to their cars, subdued, shuffling through emotions I had long anticipated. Embarrassment, guilt, and the sharp sting of realization. It was in this silence, standing in the hallway that had once been a place of routine chaos and laughter, that I fully appreciated the power of absence, foresight, and careful planning. I walked through the rooms, each one filled with memories that had once been taken for granted. The living room where my grandchildren had built forts out of blankets, the dining table polished to a shine where countless meals had been served, the kitchen counters dusted with flour from my baking. Each object, each corner, was a testament to decades of care, patience, and love. And yet, my family had treated these years of devotion as invisible, assuming I would always be present, unquestioning, and forgiving. The temporary restraining order and the media presence had done more than stop them from entering my home. They had forced them to see, in a public and undeniable way, the consequences of repeated neglect. There was no angry shouting, no dramatic confrontation beyond the legal and moral revelation of their actions. The lesson was sharp, precise, and inescapable. Their assumptions about my willingness to endure their disregard had been challenged, and they could no longer pretend ignorance. Over the next days, I received calls, hesitant at first, from neighbors, friends, and even some distant relatives who had heard about the situation. Messages poured in, expressing empathy, support, and admiration for my resolve. People began sharing their own stories of elderly relatives overlooked or dismissed, realizing that what had happened to me was, unfortunately, not unique. I understood then that my actions had created a ripple far beyond my own family. They had sparked conversations about accountability, respect, and the responsibilities of adult children toward their elders. Meanwhile, within the family, change began to stir, quietly but unmistakably. I received tentative phone calls from Danica and Wesley, apologies wrapped in awkward pauses and stammered phrases. Brielle expressed regret in writing, acknowledging that her assumptions about convenience had blinded her to the feelings of someone who had sacrificed more than she could imagine. Dominique, ever the observer, seemed to comprehend the full scope of the oversight, the gravity of the repeated exclusion. They were not fully healed, nor did I expect them to be overnight, but the awareness had taken root. Awareness, after all, is the beginning of accountability. I also reflected deeply on my own transformation. For years, I had been the caretaker, the organizer, the quiet strength holding our family together. I had foregone anger, swallowed frustrations, and endured the sting of neglect without confrontation. This experience reminded me that even in the gentlest hearts, patience has limits, and respect, when withheld, demands action. I had learned to assert my presence, not through conflict, but through measured absence and decisive planning. My dignity, finally reclaimed, became a shield and a declaration. As I settled back into my routine, the mountain cabin receding into memory and my home restored to its familiar rhythm, I realized the subtle yet profound lessons embedded in this experience. First, absence can be as loud as presence when wielded with intention. Second, repeated neglect, whether intentional or careless, requires boundaries to protect oneself. Third, preparation, patience, and foresight are often more powerful than anger or confrontation. Finally, the value of being seen and acknowledged is not diminished with age. It is amplified by decades of investment, care, and commitment. I shared these reflections with Sierra Ruiz, who captured the story with empathy and precision, highlighting the quiet strength required to address deeply personal betrayal. The story resonated widely, not for the drama alone, but for the lessons it carried. Respect for elders is not optional, accountability cannot be delayed indefinitely, and the consequences of neglect are often more immediate and public than anticipated. And to you, the viewer, I say this: consider the elders in your life. Are you present because it is convenient, or because it matters? Are your actions ensuring that respect and care are consistently delivered? Before it's too late, prove your awareness and commitment. Subscribe to this channel, so you are reminded to act with intentionality and compassion. If subscribing feels unnecessary, leave a comment explaining why respect, accountability, and loyalty can be ignored. Let's see how many still fail to understand the cost of neglect. As I reflect on these events, I am filled not with bitterness, but with clarity and empowerment. I have learned, and now my family is learning, that respect is earned through acknowledgement, and the absence of it has consequences. My story is not only about reclaiming dignity, it is about teaching lessons that endure beyond any single holiday or event. And in the quiet aftermath, I know one thing with certainty: being forgotten is no longer a possibility. Sitting back in my living room, with the soft light of the late afternoon spilling over familiar furniture, I finally allowed myself a quiet breath. The house felt like it had been through a storm and emerged unbroken, much like myself. Watching my children retreat and absorb the consequences of their choices, I realized something fundamental. Life doesn't always hand out lessons politely. Sometimes, it demands that you create them yourself, especially when those around you refuse to see the impact of their actions. Over decades, I had poured my heart into family gatherings, meals, advice, and endless small acts of care. I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and countless tiny victories, often without recognition or gratitude. And while it had once seemed natural to continue giving, I came to understand that there is a line where patience becomes exploitation, and love without acknowledgement can turn into invisibility. That line had been crossed more than once. That line had been crossed 4 times on Christmas alone. Now, in the quiet aftermath, I reflect not on anger, but on clarity. One of the first lessons I hope people understand from my story is this: boundaries are essential, even with loved ones. You do not need to endure disrespect simply because someone shares your DNA. The years of quiet patience had built my life, but they had also built expectations that my presence was guaranteed, my contributions invisible. Establishing limits, even with family, is not cruelty. It is survival, dignity, and self-respect. The second lesson is the power of intentional absence. Absence is not punishment, nor is it bitterness. It is a way to highlight what is often overlooked. When I left for my mountain cabin, I wasn't seeking revenge in the typical sense. I was creating space for reality to surface. For my family to understand, in the starkest terms possible, the consequences of neglect. Absence, wielded carefully, can be louder than any argument. It forces reflection and reveals the true priorities of those around you. I also learned that strategy, patience, and preparation are not signs of coldness. They are tools of empowerment. Planning every step, considering the legal and social implications, and quietly orchestrating the circumstances to ensure my voice could be heard was not vengeance. It was justice, accountability, and protection. Age does not diminish the ability to act decisively. In fact, experience often enhances it. Every detail, every precaution, every call to Elias and Sierra Ruiz ensured that the lesson could not be ignored. As I reflect further, the story extends beyond my personal family. This is about all of us, really. How often do we overlook the elderly in our communities? How often do we take for granted the ones who have provided care, love, and stability for decades? There is a societal lesson here. Accountability cannot be postponed indefinitely. Whether it's a parent, a grandparent, or a neighbor, consistent respect and recognition matter. Neglect is not a small offense. It carries emotional weight, often invisible until it is too late to repair casually. For the audience listening, this is your moment to pause and ask: are you living in a way that honors those who raised, mentored, or cared for you? Or are you guilty of letting convenience and business dictate your actions, leaving essential relationships fractured? Reflect honestly, because every moment of thoughtlessness can compound, and some absences are permanent. And here, dear viewer, is where I extend a challenge. You have witnessed the outcome of repeated neglect, the consequences that careful preparation and decisive action can enforce. Ask yourself, would you act differently if your inaction could cause deep hurt? If you would not allow it, subscribe now. Show that you are committed to paying attention, to acting with integrity, and to valuing those who matter most. If you hesitate, take a moment to comment below and tell us why care and accountability seem optional in your life. The reflection is real, so are the stakes. Finally, the story of this Christmas, and the weeks that followed, reminds me that dignity, respect, and self-worth are not gifts to be earned by patience alone. They are rights to be upheld. Being forgotten repeatedly is not a fate anyone should accept. The true lesson is not just for my children, but for everyone listening. Recognize, respect, and act intentionally. Your presence matters, your care matters, and your choices leave a legacy far beyond what you can immediately see. I leave you with this thought. It is never too late to restore balance, to create awareness, and to assert what is right. Plan wisely, act decisively, and never allow your presence or absence to be treated as inconsequential. Learn from my story, let it guide your decisions, strengthen your relationships, and remind you that accountability is a currency we all must honor. The world observes, actions echo, and the consequences of neglect are often larger than you imagine. The day ended with a quiet that felt almost sacred. The house, once a place of routine chaos and the bustling energy of family gatherings, now breathed in stillness. I walked through each room slowly, taking in the soft light falling across the familiar furniture, the dust motes drifting in shafts of afternoon sun, and the faint scent of pine from the wreaths I had left hanging. Everything was in its place, untouched, as if waiting for acknowledgement that had previously been denied. It was a calm that carried a strange satisfaction, one earned not by shouting or anger, but by patience, careful timing, and the courage to assert boundaries. My children had left, their expressions etched with the shock of accountability. For hours afterward, I imagined them replaying every moment, the realization of their repeated disregard sinking in. The news coverage ensured their embarrassment extended beyond the walls of our home. The public had seen the truth. They had expected to enter and witness a frail, helpless mother. Instead, they found a woman who had anticipated their actions, had prepared meticulously, and had leveraged both law and public attention to hold them accountable. Their panic, confusion, and humiliation were not cruelly manufactured. They were the natural consequences of neglect, and now they could not ignore them. I sat by the fire that evening, reflecting on what had transpired. It was not just the satisfaction of justice served. It was the clarity that comes from knowing your dignity cannot be taken for granted. It was the recognition that patience has limits and that repeated mistreatment, when unchallenged, becomes normalized. I realized that age is not a limitation, but an accumulation of experience, foresight, and resilience. What I had once accepted silently as part of family life, overlooked holidays, ignored calls, forgotten presents, was now unmistakably addressed, and the lesson would endure far longer than the immediate shock. The aftermath revealed truths that stretched beyond my own household. Friends, neighbors, and even acquaintances who had watched the story unfold reached out. They shared their own experiences of family neglect, and many expressed gratitude for my courage in taking action. The lesson became communal. Repeated disregard for an elder's presence or contributions is not trivial. It carries weight, emotional and societal. Seeing the consequences of such neglect in real time gave others permission to reflect and act. They realized that accountability is not optional, and that the cost of being forgotten can be both personal and public. Within my family, the change was slower, subtler, but unmistakable. Hesitant calls and tentative messages started to arrive. Apologies, though awkward, began to surface, and for the first time, I felt they were truly seeing me, not as an obligation, not as a background figure in their lives, but as a person whose care, love, and presence deserved recognition. Actions, as I knew well, spoke louder than words. And now, their actions would have to align with their newfound understanding, or the consequences of their neglect would continue to be undeniable. This experience reinforced vital lessons for everyone listening. 1. Absence, when deliberate and purposeful, is a powerful teacher. 2. Dignity and self-respect are not optional, regardless of age or family ties. 3. Preparation and foresight can turn vulnerability into strength, and patience can become an instrument of accountability rather than passive suffering. And 4. The recognition of love, care, and presence should never be postponed or taken for granted. To those watching, I issue a final challenge. Reflect on your actions toward the elders in your life. Are you present because it is convenient, or because it is meaningful? Are your gestures of care consistent and genuine, or sporadic and self-serving? Accountability is not hypothetical. It is immediate. Do not wait until absence or silence forces you to confront what you should have prioritized long ago. Subscribe to this channel if you are committed to respecting and valuing those who shaped your life. If you hesitate, leave a comment explaining why care and loyalty can be ignored. Your reasoning will speak volumes. As I close this chapter, I feel no bitterness, only empowerment. The story of this Christmas, of the weeks that followed, is now more than a personal narrative. It is a lesson in dignity, accountability, and the consequences of neglect. The family I raised, the home I maintained, the love I gave unconditionally, they are all part of a legacy that will not be dismissed. The echoes of my actions resonate beyond my household, serving as a reminder that being forgotten is never inevitable. Respect, care, and recognition must be upheld, and sometimes, it takes courage, planning, and deliberate absence to ensure the lesson is truly understood. And so, to every viewer, remember, your presence matters, your actions carry weight, and neglect, whether intentional or careless, will be noticed eventually. Let this story guide your choices, strengthen your relationships, and inspire you to act before it is too late. The consequences of inaction are real, and the echoes of neglect linger far longer than you expect. Protect those you love. Act with integrity. Respect the years and sacrifices of those who came before you. In doing so, you ensure that presence is never taken for granted, and that kindness, care, and acknowledgement remain part of your legacy. Weeks passed after that decisive morning, and life in my home settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and strangely empowered. My children, now more aware than ever of the boundaries they had crossed, approached interactions differently. Calls became less sporadic and more intentional. Messages were thoughtful rather than reactive. Even the grandchildren noticed a subtle shift, not in what they received materially, but in the quality of attention, acknowledgement, and presence. The lesson, although learned under dramatic circumstances, had begun to take root. I often reflect on the broader implications of what occurred. It was not just a story about a Christmas forgotten or a family caught off guard. It was about the way society values, or too often fails to value, those who have spent a lifetime giving care, stability, and love. Friends, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances began reaching out, sharing similar experiences of elders being overlooked, dismissed, or minimized. Many of them confessed that they had felt powerless to intervene, uncertain how to make their concerns heard, or hesitant to challenge what they assumed was normal family behavior. My story, widely covered by Sierra Ruiz and shared across social circles, became a source of validation and inspiration. People recognized that standing up, setting boundaries, and ensuring accountability is not just acceptable, it is necessary. There is a particular satisfaction in witnessing change unfold quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. My family's interactions began to reflect awareness and effort rather than automatic assumption. Wesley, who had always been preoccupied with appearances, now paused to ask questions that revealed genuine curiosity and concern. Danica became more deliberate in including me in planning and communication, understanding the impact of exclusion. Brielle's messages reflected accountability rather than defensiveness, and Dominique's quiet support ensured that shifts were maintained. These were not forced gestures. They were the natural outcomes of confronting the reality of consequences. And yet, the most meaningful change was internal. I, Beatrice Albright, came to see that empowerment often arises from asserting one's boundaries with precision, patience, and patience coupled with foresight. It is not about inflicting punishment for the sake of satisfaction. It is about ensuring that one's presence and contributions are respected. The value of a person's attention, love, and effort cannot be assumed, and repeated neglect requires deliberate action to highlight the disparity between expectation and reality. This story also reinforced for me the importance of community. The support of friends, neighbors, and those who watched my story unfold gave weight to my actions. It showed that personal accountability is strengthened when combined with societal awareness. There is a ripple effect. One action taken to uphold respect and dignity can inspire reflection, accountability, and change far beyond the immediate circle. My choice to involve the news, the lawyer, and even the local charities was not vanity, it was strategy. It ensured that the lesson would reach a wider audience, encouraging others to confront neglect, injustice, and oversight before it becomes irreversible. For viewers, the takeaway is simple but profound. Consider the people who have given decades of love and care in your life. Reflect not only on your intentions but on the tangible impact of your presence, attention, and respect. Neglect is not harmless. Silence, absence, and disregard can inflict emotional wounds that persist long after holidays and celebrations have passed. Demonstrate awareness. Act intentionally. Value the years, sacrifices, and care of those who shaped your life. And now, to you, the viewer, your role is not passive. You have witnessed how repeated neglect can escalate and how accountability can create meaningful change. Show your commitment to intentional care. Subscribe to this channel, not merely for the story, but to ensure that respect, attention, and awareness remain part of your life. If you hesitate, leave a comment below explaining why recognition and care are negotiable in your world. Your words will reveal more than you realize. In the quiet moments of reflection, I understand that the impact of this Christmas, of the 2 weeks of absence, and the eventual confrontation is enduring. It is not about resentment. It is about ensuring fairness, accountability, and the preservation of dignity. My home remains a place of warmth, memory, and legacy, but now it is also a testament to the power of deliberate action, awareness, and courage. The echoes of this experience reach far beyond my family. They touch anyone who has been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. As I close this chapter of my story, I leave you with a challenge. Do not wait for absence or crisis to enforce respect. Engage actively, honor those who deserve it, and ensure that your presence, or absence, carries the weight it should. Kindness, acknowledgement, and attention are not optional. They are essential to meaningful relationships. Let this story guide your actions, remind you of what truly matters, and inspire you to act with intentionality every day. Your legacy, like mine, is built not just on the moments you celebrate, but on the care, respect, and recognition you provide consistently, without fail. The house returned to its natural rhythm, quiet yet full of purpose. Each room carried the memory of recent events, but now imbued with a sense of order and earned respect. The confrontation had ended not with anger or rage, but with a truth that could not be ignored. Repeated neglect has consequences, and intentional action can shift the balance. My family had learned, in the clearest possible way, that their actions, or inactions, left marks far beyond a single holiday. I walked through the kitchen, touching the familiar surfaces, the faint scent of lingering cookies reminding me of decades of care I had poured into this home. It was a symbolic gesture, everything in its place, a reflection of how I intended to maintain control over my own life and dignity. There was no need for dramatic statements or physical force. The reality of my preparation, the legal framework, and the presence of witnesses had created an unassailable truth. They could no longer claim ignorance, nor could they dismiss responsibility. Accountability had arrived quietly but decisively. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes became apparent. Phone calls were answered with attentiveness rather than habit. Messages were returned thoughtfully rather than rushed. Invitations included everyone intentionally, rather than by default. The grandchildren, unaware of the full legal and media involvement, sensed the shift in tone. They felt the difference in care, acknowledgement, and presence, and it reinforced lessons that would shape them in years to come. They saw that respect is not automatic. It is nurtured, observed, and defended. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that empowerment often comes in unexpected forms. Absence, when applied with precision, becomes a voice louder than any argument. Strategy and patience become tools for influence and protection. And most importantly, dignity and self-respect are never negotiable, regardless of age or circumstance. My actions were not vindictive, they were corrective, a demonstration of the natural consequences of persistent neglect. Justice, when enacted thoughtfully, carries a weight far greater than anger ever could. For the audience, the lesson extends beyond this household. Relationships, familial or otherwise, require consistent care, acknowledgement, and accountability. Neglect is not trivial. It leaves scars that are invisible until they manifest in absence, silence, or distance. Every interaction carries weight, and intentional respect for those who gave their lives to support you is never optional. Presence must be deliberate, and absence, when necessary, can highlight truths that words often fail to convey. And now, dear viewer, I leave you with a final reflection and a challenge. Ask yourself, do your actions honor those who have shaped your life, or do they take for granted the love, care, and attention you receive? If your answer is yes, show your commitment by subscribing. If you hesitate, share in the comments why acknowledgement and respect are optional in your world. Your reasoning will reveal as much about you as my story does about my family. The choice is yours, but the consequences of inaction are unmistakable, and their echoes last far longer than you expect. As I close this chapter of my life, I do so with peace. The house is intact, my dignity preserved, and the lesson delivered in a way that cannot be ignored. The Albright Sterling family learned the cost of repeated oversight. And for everyone watching, the story serves as a reminder. Respect, care, and intentional presence are not gifts. They are obligations of the heart, mind, and conscience. Protect them. Uphold them. Let no one forget their value, least of all those who have given their lives to ensure your own.